So make sure you're recording who you are.
Trim the beginning.
Yes.
You've seen it. Oh, come on.
Okay. Two.
It's brain, as usual.
Okay.
It's like the engine, the brain.
Sure. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Welcome to event number 6 of our Photogrammetry Institute. My name is Matt Hunter. I'm the digital scholarship librarian over at Sturgeon. My GA Amanda Brito here has been helping me with hosting these events. Again, this is 6 in a series of 8. Our 7th one is planned for April 4th. We have another one planned on April 24th.
Yes.
24th? Late April. It'll be on the calendar. So you'll if you've showed up to one of these events in the past, you will get an email about it. But what the aim of this institute is to bring people together who are working on remote sensing, 3D applications, interactive and immersive environments as part of their scholarship to come together and sort of learn from each other, create a group across campus, spanning disciplines and departments, methodologies and research interests to come together to sort of share our expertise, share our knowledge, and kind of just make sure that we're collaborating and communicating well. Today, we're looking at aspects of disseminating and publishing the work of photogrammetry and 3D scanning and making and recreating 3D models with a particular focus because it was sort of convenient to me for classical archaeology. So I'm joined today by Dr. Andrea De Giorgi, professor of classical studies in the FSU Classics Department, and Dr. Allison Smith, recent 22 FSU Classics Department alumna and current visiting assistant professor of classical scholarship at Indiana University Bloomington. Did I get that right? Close enough. Okay. Today, what we're going to be talking about is some of the work that I have very selfishly glommed onto of a long-running project on the COSA excavations, which I'll have Allison and Dr. De Giorgi kind of explain a little bit more thoroughly here in a minute. But what I'm really interested in is the way the COSA excavations and the digital COSA excavations component of this project have explored new uses of technology, including virtual reality, 3D scanning, photogrammetry, for looking at things such as dissemination, publication, outreach, and public engagement. And so what I'd like to do is sort of chat briefly about the ways that the archaeological aspect of this excavation has been augmented and implemented technology, and then think about it, how I approach this as a non-subject or non-disciplinary expert, but someone who's thinking about this in terms of publication, preservation, dissemination, and engagement with a larger audience. So I have already done some introductions, but I'm now going to do the thing where I ask you to reintroduce yourselves. Okay, so Dr. De Giorgi, please.
Okay, so I'm Andrea De Giorgi, and I'm professor of classics here at FSU, and I directed the COSA excavations since 2013 in partnership with Allison Smith and Glenn, who's not on the screen today and couldn't make it. It makes all the sense in the world to be here, especially with you, Matt, and in general with Strozer, in that we really spearheaded an initiative that is designed to basically store the entire body of our data sets at Strozer, so that down the line, basically this incredible corpus of information is going to be accessible to the greater FSU community, but also to sort of like some communities of archaeologists and enthusiasts at large, but we will find a way to sort of like work along those lines. But what really matters to me is to stress that yes, we are going to be talking about an excavation that basically is rooted in a long tradition of American archaeology in Italy. But we took this facet of the story, and I think we added like a few steroids so that we can do things a little differently. And not just because we want to make sure that we use all the state-of-the-art technology, or because we try to be cool, or sort of like add sort of like that twist. It's really that we want to produce a scholarship that is durable, that is accessible, and obviously that shows the great things that we do here at FSU first and foremost. But also the idea of like sort of like continuing an old excavation albeit with a sort of like a new angle. That is really sort of like what has driven actually this project. So is the slideshow, can you?
Yeah, Allison, do you want to
If you can start the slideshow, please.
start the slideshow, Allison?
Yeah, give me just 1 second.
Sure. Excellent, thank you.
Here we go. I really don't want to dwell on the archaeology of Koza and sort of the whole sort of story of the ancient settlement. It's a Roman colony. It's a quintessential Republican city, greatly transformed through the ages, but it's a modest town. It's really not like a central place by any stretch of the mind. But it's for strictly educational purposes, Koza has it all. I mean, you want to see sort of like how things function, like, how the Romans built their things, how they tested the materials, how they tested cement, trial and error, all of that kind of stuff. You can see at Koza. So it makes a lot of sense for us to work there, but we also draw on a very important legacy. 1949, Frank Brown is gentleman, perhaps the next slide, Allison. This gentleman here, Frank Brown, a real trailblazer. Professor at Yale, eventually known professor at the American Academy of Rome. He started this excavation at Koza with a view for documenting sort of the ideal Roman city, and a city that, albeit very small, would replicate, however, sort of the feats of Rome, and sort of like, and also like, the monumental corollary of Republican Rome. It was certainly not on the mark, it turned out, but we don't need to get into that. What really matters is that there was like an incredible investment by the American Academy in Rome, Koza, at this very small and almost insignificant site. An investment that is an activity that began in 1949, and it went on until 99. Eventually, enter FSU. We basically sort of like took it on again, and here we are, 10 years later, basically sort of like grappling with this remarkable site. And this is Frank Brown looking in his prime. Next slide, please. My main point here is that, like I said, I'd like to rehash the fact that we really draw upon a very important legacy, but especially a legacy that has a lot of gravitas in that we're dealing with 50 years of a steady output of scholarly works. The American Academy in Rome has a Koza series that is monographs. The memoirs of the Academy in Rome have been publishing sort of stuff from Koza since, again, like the 1950s. So there's like a monumental output against which we're basically sort of like we started to sort of like develop our own strategy. In the sense that we have the fortune to sort of like to have so much that we can rely on in terms of information, whether material, historical, or simply like archaeological. This is but a small sample of the incredible amount of scholarship that again we benefit from. As we, however, sort of like begin our excavation at Koza, it seemed important to us to sort of like to make sense of this like monumental, staggering, gargantuan sort of like collection of works. Not just because we could use them and sort of like tap into the sources and help our students to sort of navigate the complexity of archaeology, but we really wanted to sort of like make sure that we will produce some kind of like interface that would basically take all this and sort of create like the digital, like digitally speaking, and thus build a foundation upon which sort of we would sort of build our own excavation. So digital COSA sort of started in tandem with the beginning of the excavations, with very much with the view to we're digitizing all this, creating maps, creating sort of like a digital foundation for and a solid underpinning for what we intended to do in the field. And again, sort of like in the first two seasons, we kind of like tiptoed around the site and not really sort of knowing where we wanted to go. We started playing with a drone, we started playing with photogrammetry, taking tons of photos. Matt Brennan and Allison Smith sort of like were the two engines of sort of like their curiosity, their willingness to sort of to try things and to sort of like to model things, even though sort of like we weren't exactly sure as to what was the proper way of doing things. I mean, there wasn't really sort of like a sense of orthodoxy. But first and foremost, we started like building models, very simple, very basic, like 3D models of the entire site, of the entire promontory. Trying to sort of like basically sort of try to insert and inject tiny pieces of information taken from all these books, whether it was like plans or it was like a trench, anything that was material that indicated sort of like previous studies, previous analysis. So we kind of incorporated all this and created this like solid, robust framework. Now, next slide, please. And do keep in mind that this is not sort of like the kind of sort of like small. It is a small size when you compare COSA to any sort of like major classical city, like with the grandeur and the big buildings, but it's sort of like it's 13 hectares, so it's a decently sized site, and there's a lot of like buildings, and here you have a sense of where we are, where we over. Not too bad. I get that. I mean, there are worse places to go. With that being said, I mean, this is also a very topographically diverse setting, so we had to also sort of like make some serious adjustments in terms of sort of like the technology we would use, how we would fly the drone, how we would sort of like reckon with stuff that was visible back in the 1950s, but guess what? It's no more. Where is it now? All kinds of questions of this sort. As the next. Actually, do the next one, please. With this in mind, we started like playing with drones, with photogrammetry, sort of like basically creating like sketches of objects in trenches. Matt, would you please open that link to that website?
Do you want me to share it? I think I have it open.
Oh, yeah.
If you have it,
the virtual
All right.
tour the site.
Yeah, let me switch screens real quick.
Yeah, thank you.
Great.
There we go. You can play around with it a little bit and move the things a bit just to add some action to it. Thank you, Allison. This is but a simple example, sort of like we've been building in terms of various Matt Brennan or other partner in crime. This is but a simple example, sort of like what we've been up to with like all this technology, other than the building a digital model for the entire promontory, and that is work in progress because it's very complicated. But we've also created sort of like this virtual tour. So in so doing, we have collected gazillion of images from every single sort of like site, whether it's a bath or say the temple on the Capitolium, the forum gate. You can see on the to the left that there's quite a long list of sites that we had modeled, and now it can be perused, and it can be sort of like used for all kinds of purposes. I mean, this is sort of like, the most basic application, but it's great because it's also a way to sort of like, to show what the site is like, sort of it's a way to give that hands-on experience to sort of like our virtual visitors, and you get also a sense of sort of like, the general complexity of the site itself. Again, and this is sort of like the kind of like application that sort of like makes the site understandable to say the enthusiast is sort of like the historian, the student. I mean, there's really so much that can benefit sort of like the general public. And here's, for instance, like the excavation of the bath with the FSU team in action. So this is hands down sort of like the most sort of like straightforward application of sort of like what we have achieved. Allison is going to take us through sort of like into some upper plateaus in a few minutes. But I'd like to also mention one more point. Allison, perhaps we can go back to the slideshow, please. And the previous slide, please. There you go. This is sort of like in this slide here, sort of like captures some of the directions that sort of like that we are taking, and sort of like this idea that sort of starting in basic, starting with like simple digital model of things and features, sort of like enables, however, sort of like some pretty sophisticated and finely grained analysis. Like for instance, sort of like in this ongoing study of the city walls that we are completing at this time. It really starts with a solid model of the city walls, and it starts with a drone that basically flies over and collects these linear points, and then sort of like the whole processing eventually sort of like it yields a sort of a robust sort of representation of the materiality of things. Just to give you an example of what I've been doing, what I've been working with, along with some of my colleagues, a model of the city walls, so like with the possibility of creating the energetics, the time that has been spent in sort of like in cutting the stone, moving the stone, basically the labor, sort of like energies, really extremely human terms. This is the kind of like analysis that we can do here in Tallahassee. We don't need to be because this is real information, real data. It's not just cosmetics. And we've been playing with these walls, with the lines of these walls. And for instance, so like we're now studying this wall against the background of the information that we know about a wall that was constructed with a similar technique in the 1820s in the city of Verona, Italy. 3rd century BC, 19th century, you can do that. I mean, it's this idea of like, the cost of things, the labor, how do you cut a stone, same building technique, it's polygonal masonry. But for that specific wall of the 19th century, we actually had a manual that the guys sort of like took the piece to write. This is how you build this wall. And we're basically sort of like using the model of that 19th century wall to basically to sort of better understand sort of like how long it took because of builders to complete like its very early certification. So the point being, I'm going beyond sort of like where I'm headed with this. Point being is that these models that we produce and process at the site during sort of like the very short span of time that we are in Italy, eventually sort of like are incredibly powerful because it enabled us to sort of like to do so much work, to process so much data, and come up with like some fairly sophisticated sort of interpretations and studies. And come think of it, so like the technology is not that expensive. I mean, flying a drone, I mean, nowadays it's sort of like it's a pretty affordable operation. You have to comply comply with, of course, sort of like, flying regulations. And that's a different ballgame. But for instance, like in our case, mainly the authorities are pretty relaxed about that. I mean, so long as you don't go beyond a certain height. But we haven't had any issues. So this is just like, basically the beginning of like, so like, I'm moving away from like the general presentation of the site and this wedding of all data with new frameworks. And I given you a sense of sort of like what we're doing in terms of sort of like just documenting the site. But this application here sort of like I think opens sort of like the possibility for more sort of like sophisticated discussions. And this is perhaps sort of the juncture where I should have Allison enter the picture, where basically she's gonna take this whole thing to get another level, like upper echelon, as it were. So Allison, the podium is yours. Take it away.
All right, can everybody hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah.
All right, great. So we've been putting together, I guess I'll go through here. So Dr. De Giorgi just talked about sort of at a larger scale, what we've been doing at COSA. And what I want to focus on now is what we've been doing in our excavations since 2013 with the bathhouse, which we have been excavating since the beginning. So just to sort of situate ourselves geographically here, we have COSA up here, about 90 miles, 90 kilometers, I can never remember, up from Rome, but it's up this Tyrrhenian coast. You just saw the beautiful coastline that we have a lovely vista of every day when we go and excavate. The bathhouse that we've been excavating is here in the middle of the town. And what we have up here, this is the bath complex. So this area, I hope you can see my mouse. But this area here is the bath complex that we have been excavating since the really initial days of us going to COSA and rebuilding the American excavations at this site here. But in 2015, we started to experiment with 3D modeling, bringing in 3D technologies to record. When we initially started, we used drone technology, drone photos to build a sort of large site plan. And then in 2015 and a little bit in 2015, but mostly in 2016, we really started to look individually at each distinct trench that we would open. So we would have more than one trench open during the season of excavation. So between 4 to 6 trenches where you have trench supervisors overseeing volunteers who help to excavate over the course of, usually we're there for the month of June. So between 4-5 weeks-ish. When we started taking these individual trench photos, generally we reserved these trench photos for these trench models for the end of the season, just to record what we had ultimately found, and then compare that with, say, the site plan that's generated by the architects who come with their total stations and build up a nice plan of the site for us, so we can compare that digitally with these 3D models and look at things not only in a sort of 2-dimensional space, but with these a sort of 3-dimensional space here. And then over the course of 2016, we started to experiment with also doing, full season models that we could then build and create this sort of time lapse, if you will, of the models that we've been creating of the excavations at hand. So not only excavating the end product of the excavation, but also the step-by-step process of the excavation, which would help us clearly in and outside of the field to look at these contexts and to have these contexts to be able to recreate these contexts digitally and take them home with us, which we can't do when we come home from field work. We can't take the trenches home with us. So this is our sort of a good representation of what we are excavating, but also to show this to other people, to show this to to students in an archaeological class, for example, and explain to them the sort of steps that are taken, the layers that are exposed over the course of excavation. So, for example, here is a very large photograph of sort of all of the trench models that we've taken over the years, compiled and compared with the site plan that is generated for us at the end of the season. So getting as close as possible to the actual dimensions of the site itself. It's a little bit confusing, it's a little bit difficult to read, but it's really helpful for us to sort of recognize how the picture of the bath is put together, which is hard to do over, the span of, now it's been, 10 years since we've started this. And after each season, we are, made to backfill each of these trenches. So each of these trenches, for the most part, have been filled back in with soil. So this total picture is something that is not consistent with the reality of the site as we see it today. So this is a really good way to visualize, although it is, granted, a little bit busy and confusing maybe, but it's a good way for us to remember, revisualize, and get a better sense of the architecture as a whole, which does not exist today at COSA and in reality. But I want to show you, so we started to, as I said, take these step-by-step trench models over the course of excavation. There are difficulties with this, though, because the site of COSA, it's not only a beautiful archaeological site, but it's also an olive grove. So there's tons of these olive trees scattered throughout the site. This is a reason why we have some of these holes in this bigger picture, composite orthographic image. This also creates difficulty because trees cast shadow. And so it's very difficult to find the best time throughout the day to take these trench models as well. So that sort of figures in as to when we want to take these trench models, what's the best time to stop, what's the best time to clean everything up, take these trench models. But here's just a taste of what we have been able to do. So this is this one trench in the southeastern corner of the bathhouse. This is this room. It's probably a poditarium, a changing room, at least an entry room into the bathhouse. And so over the course of this June month in the season of 2019, we stopped at intervals, designated by the trench supervisor, who was me, so I did this. We took photographs when we thought, or we took photographs for models when we thought it would be a good time, a good representative image model to highlight what we have been seeing over the course of the excavation. And so we did this here with this trench, but what I want to show you, what I want to sort of highlight here is something that we've been experimenting with, and we are just starting this endeavor here. So if there are people who sort of have worked in a tangential field or have used something along these lines to build something similar, please let us know. So what we wanted to do was take these steps, take these interval models, and then put them into some sort of interactive, immersive environment that we could explore, revisit, and then use also in an educational environment and an outreach environment to talk about what we do as archaeologists and to sort of recreate the experience that we have when we are excavating, at least as closely as possible, and to do this in a way that is, again, both immersive and that people can get as close of a sense as possible to reality, to actual experience in the field. And this goes back to Matt Brennan. Matt Brennan is really the sort of evil mastermind behind this project. He's the one who puts these things together. And so I'm going to try to use his information as much as possible, but I'm not the architect of this by any means. I'm just the at this point the mouthpiece for Matt Brennan on this. But one thing that we tried to do this past season was take a trench, this trench over here in the southwestern corner of the bathhouse, and go step by step, getting as much information as possible, just like we did in the trench at the southeast corner, this area down here, but expand that in a way. And so we used this material, this specific trench. We used this specific trench because compared to the other trench models that had also been taken over the course of the season, it had, some of the most interesting features. We were able to play around with the features of this virtual reality environment that I'll talk about and that I'll show you in just a second. It was also, fortunately for us, it was the best models that came out in terms of the quality that we had and the shadows that were being cast in the photo models. And what we did was we took this and we built this 3D immersive environment using the 3D models that we've taken, in this case, not with a drone, but with a handheld camera. It was a Sony Alpha, I think 7000, I can't remember the model number, but some, Sony Alpha handheld camera. And here you can see these are the individual photo models that were then put into this environment, which was then used, sorry, let me get this information correct here. We used Unity to take this state model that had been taken a few years ago and built upon, and we inserted this trench into this area of the state model. And then we were able to sort of play around with what we wanted to do. So I'm going to try to show you this video. I don't know how the rate's if it's gonna work very well, considering we're in different locations and this is over Zoom. So maybe if the video is a little bit choppy, we could switch.
Yeah, I can run it here if it doesn't work.
Okay, all right, I'll give it a shot, but we'll see how it goes. Let me get it set up here real quick. All right, so what we're using here is we have I'll start it in just a second. We have a specific software to produce a VR environment here. We have Unity software, which is this real-time 3D visualization engine that allows the development of interactive simulations on a number of platforms, including wireless virtual reality headsets, which is what we use here. This Unity here it's free for educational use. It has extensive online documentation, a thriving marketplace for free, paid, and open source extensions. So it's a really versatile tool here. What we have here is the virtual reality toolkit, and we use this with the Meta Quest 2 VR headset. So this is what you're going to be seeing. This is just a recording of Matt using the headset and sort of going through this virtual environment at COSA. So is it too choppy?
I think it's okay.
Okay, so what we have here, we're in this south western corner of the state model. What we tried to build is a sort of interactive environment for people so that we could use this sort of menu here and you could cycle through the different trenches, and it'll start again. This is just a freeze frame. It'll cycle through the SU trench photo models that were taken over the course of the 2022 season. And so you can reconstruct the process of excavation, maybe not to the greatest degree of accuracy in terms of, we took our trowel and this is this much dirt we took off, but, it gives a better sense of what we're trying to do here. We're also going to try to integrate the paperwork that we have. And so when people are looking at a trench, they can see what the excavators were thinking and the measurements and the soil types and the artifacts that were involved or included in the trench. We have sketches, which we're going to clean up, obviously, or hope to clean up. But you can see sort of what everything is in this drawing, and we're going to try to incorporate the artifacts that were found in specific layers so you could, see what was found visually. But I think what is a really interesting tool here is the interactive measurements that we have. This is very interesting because it's difficult to, with pressing time, get as many measurements or all the measurements that you might want to take, and you might come out of the field and say, oh, I should have taken this measurement, or I want to compare some measurement to something else, but I'm not going to be able to take that until I go back again to COSA in 11 months. But with this feature, you can measure these materials, the whole trench, effectively in the 3D environment. We're going to try to sort of integrate so the measurements pop up. Right now, they are spit out once you leave the program. They're spit out onto onto a form that then you sort of have to remember which measurements you took first, etc. But if you go in with a plan, that's feasible. But this is just something we're sort of playing with, an idea we're toying with to really build up this use of the model, to extend the use of a 3D photo model so that we can use it, oops, it's going to play again. So we can use it in the field, we can use it out of the field, we can use it in post-excavation analysis and research, we can use it, which I think is a really helpful tool for sites that do have to do things like backfill their trenches after the season has finished, for safety purposes, for conservation purposes, so that you don't have to re-excavate an architectural feature or something to get measurements, or maybe to get relative measurements, but also extending this into the classroom, extending this into outreach to give a better visualization of what archaeology is, and sort of start to dispel the myth of Indiana Jones and all the great sort of, fantastical ideas of what archaeology is, but get into the sense of all the nitty-gritty things of our work and what we do to explain what's happening here. There's a lot more that I can go over, and Andrea can go over, and Matt can go over, but I'm going to stop here, I suppose, and maybe ask Matt and Andrea to take over from here again.
Sure. Yeah, I just wanted to share a couple of other things that kind of tie into kind of square the circle, I guess. And so, Allison, what you've been talking about, all of this great work, and Andrea's sort of like intellectual background of what we're interested in doing with this site. One of the things that I've been working on as part of this process, so I'm going to take over screen sharing. One of the things that I've been really interested in working on is thinking about the sort of scholarly infrastructure and sort of scholarly process that comes after all of this, right? So Allison and the COSA team, and Andrea and the COSA team, the entire COSA team, do the work of excavating. They do the work of recording and interpreting, and then thinking about what that means. And Andrea showed us this massive backlog of publications that have been disseminated and exist as a record of the COSA project over the last 70 years. What I'm interested in is then figuring out how we can include not just the pages and pages of written notes with photographs and sketches in hardbound copies, but then thinking about how the work that Allison just showed us can be disseminated as part of the scholarly record of the COSA project beyond this. And so to that extent, what I'm working on with a handful of folks over in the web development team and the libraries is thinking about how we can leverage the scholarly infrastructure that the libraries has become accustomed to providing, which is a place that scholarship produced by scholars of the institution is held, preserved, disseminated, and shared in something like Digital. So Digital is the institutional repository for FSU, where we provide a place to sort of store and preserve scholarly outputs of FSU faculty and students in a way that is accessible to future generations. Ideally, right, digital preservation is its own sticky widget, and obviously we don't want to get too deep into how long computers are ever going to last. But there are things that we're interested in preserving that get more complicated when they're not just words on a page, right? So how do you preserve the monograph that is produced at the end of this project and an interactive 3D component that allows you to pop on a VR headset and kind of interact with the site throughout the course of a 10-year excavation cycle. So part of this is developing a metadata schema And that's, data about the project and data about the project that fit into not only the sort of repository database level field, so the things that the database needs to understand about who created the thing, when it was created, what file type, and all that kind of stuff. It's sort of the boring bread and butter of how the computer needs to be able to read the stuff, but make that include and provide spaces for the archaeological data that is important to record to also be included. So we're talking about things like, so these are test collections, and I actually don't think there's anything in these right now. But we have the structure there for whenever we start doing the massive project uploading, which I think we started, 5 or 6 years ago, and then stopped, and then we'll need to do again. But what Allison was showing was sort of like these procedural documents of like the forms, the paperwork that is sort of documenting the day-to-day activities. That's really important for a later scholar to be able to come back and say like, oh, you interpreted this marble column as a grain grinding cornerstone, and it actually turns out that it's like the top of a really poorly carved statue or something like that. I want to know at what point that decision changed or at what point that decision was made. So you need the sort of record of decisions, and I'm sure Allison and Andrea can correct all of the parts of that I kind of neatly glossed over for non-specialists. But that information is important to record in something like this database, where you have things like stratigraphic units, right? So like, where is this, the thing that this form represents, where is that included in the architectural plan, in the excavation history, in the sort of depth of how deep into the excavation season it went, what month, what day, et cetera. Like all of these things that are important to have for the academic and sort of intellectual purposes, and how that fits in something like this database, which is really meant to, and was built to sort of have, here is a journal article written by Dr. De Giorgi that was published on June 2023. That's sort of the extent of what this system was originally conceived to portray. And now we're asking it to do not only that, but also who in the field wrote this documentation, who was the illustrator of the small box in the middle, who was the group of students that were excavating that site, at what point did this paperwork become revised, when was it scanned? And so all of these more complicated things that are interested, that we are interested in recording for sort of like the provenance of the scholarly merit of the work that's being taken place, or the work that has taken place. And then what do you do with the stuff that you generate that isn't just flat 2D things, right? So these are some of the objects that, so Allison has shown some really great examples of the site models themselves, so the trenches themselves. But then when we're looking at the actual finds and the objects that, again, once they come up out of the soil, you can't take them out of Italy. So if you're looking for measurements, or you're looking for any sort of like investigation of the bottom of that one lamp, if you didn't take a picture of it, or you didn't get a good enough drawing or anything or measurement, you might have to wait 11 months to go see it again. And if Sketchpad will work, okay, open. Okay, so when you have these scans, what you can do is then investigate all the different parts that you might want to take measurements with if the scanning process is done correctly. So Allison mentions that, all of this documentation work that you have to do, just documenting with photographs the different steps of the excavation itself. You also need to do this for individual objects. And so we have this example of the 3D scanner that we've been using, which is great. It generates a model that looks super fancy. But if I don't know if this is 2.5 feet long or 2.5 centimeters long, that's not a great model. So you have to do all this documentation. There's a lot of work that's happening that has to be recorded for these types of things, so that they become useful objects to investigate, right? And so you have to capture all of this metadata. So you have weight, you have size, you have like information about what was scanned using what technology and what like software, so that 20 years from now, hopefully, when this is being used for someone's dissertation or for the next, COSA 12, the monograph. What you can do is you have this record of all of the things that if we say that this is scanned with this particular scanner, and 5 years from now, it turns out that all of the models that were ever produced with that scanner were off by like an order of magnitude, someone's going to want to know that. So you need to record all of that. And while this is super nice and pretty to look at in a tool called Sketchfab, which is just sort of like this a really common online, freely usable 3D hosting software, Sketchfab is a for-profit commercial entity that has no obligation to continue to preserve this data. So if we're saying that all of the digital COSA models live on Sketchfab, that's great until Sketchfab decides that it no longer wants to host anything and it wants to sell out to some mega tech conglomerate that says, you know what, we're not going to do anything with cultural heritage, delete it all, save some space for models of shoes or cars or whatever it ends up being. So we need to have a way to host that within the academy in a way that is important and for the academy so that we can continue to do scholarship, which is why we're interested in developing our own tools that are academy owned, academy run, academy directed. So one example of this, and this is a really rudimentary model that I made of two of the sites that Allison already sort of showed, but this is a combined excavation for 2016 and 2017. Allison's looks a lot better because it has colors and textures and things like that. This is like my first foray into 3D modeling, so it's really bad. But what's important is that we now have within digital a place to deposit, store, and interact with 3D objects. So all of the stuff that we're generating as part of this site, as part of this excavation, all the models that Andrea has been guiding us to do with all the intellectual work and all of this sort of bread and butter archaeology, all of the work that Allison has been doing to document things with higher technology and with 3D models and with interactive components, all of the work that Brennan has been doing is sort of creating this way that we can perform outreach and sort of like present these models to folks that are not necessarily classics faculty members working on research. We can make this available to K through 12. We can make this available to like elementary school kids that may want to be Indiana Jones, and we can say, yeah, Indiana Jones sure is cool, but you know what's even cooler? We get to do this, he never did. So there's fun things that we can do with all of this, and we can do this in a way that allows us to sort of interact with the objects in the way that the sort of like marketplace of ideas is going with things like Sketchfab, but in a way that answers the needs that we have as the academy, as scholars that are looking to look at, again, what is the actual measurement of this thing? Who did it? Who was their advisor? What part of the dissertation was it used in? Like all of this kind of like weird stuff that, Joe Schmo, who doesn't actually work in academia, care about, but it's important for others of us. So we want to make sure that we have all that information available. So I'm really interested in this aspect of it, where we kind of do all of the work and then have a space where we can preserve all of that work and like share that work for the things that we value as an academic community, which is like the part that is less sexy to talk about, right? Like how many people really care about the metadata about 3D objects when you can go like look at Allison's really cool models and play it in virtual reality? Some of us, me, Stuart, I'm staring at. But yeah, I think that's like an important part of this whole thing to be talking about. I know Nancy DeGrumman is in the Zoom audience. I know she's been working on this a lot with her Chatamura and Dokianti excavations. And I think this is a thing that's really important to think about, because lots of people are doing it and lots of people are doing it in their sort of little bubbles because it's nice and helpful to do in your project, in your space. But this work should benefit everyone, right? So like what we're developing for COSA should work for Chatamura. It should work for the Sardinia project that FSU also does, right? Like it should work for all of the other excavations that aren't in Italy, right? We should be able to do this with the anthropology work that's happening at Mission San Luis right down the road. And ideally, what we can do with this then is use these case studies and like talk with people in things like this Photogrammetry Institute to other people that might say like, hey, you're 95% of the way there for what I want to do. can you do this thing? And maybe it's just as easy as turning on a button that we decided to turn off because, you know, Chedmore and Koza didn't need it. And if you need it for this other thing, hey, we've now made this available for so many other academic audiences, so many other audiences that can use it. That's what really jazzes me about this whole project. Like obviously, like going to a beautiful site in Italy and playing with their 3D scanner is not bad, but the other 11 months when you sort of work on this type of stuff, I still get really excited about this type of thing. And I hope that it's useful to the work that we're all sort of dealing with. So that's all I wanted to say. We have.
If I may just weigh in.
Is it? Okay, yeah. So we have plenty of time. So
If I just may weigh in, so like, you know, piggybacking on what you were saying. Matt, you don't take enough credit for sort of like, you know, for leading an Herculean enterprise, because let's face it, we're feeding digitals with tons of data, tons of information. But it's very diverse in nature. We give them sort of like 3D sketches of trenches, you just saw them. We give them like copies of notebooks, objects. So the nature of the evidence is so diverse. I mean, you get like, you know, all kinds of things. And basically we've told Matt like, hey, we're dumping all of this. And you understand that you have to make some very specific choices in terms of sort of like, you know, where you're headed. I mean, the beauty of this system is such that it's flexible, it's resilient, and you can make changes. It's not that once you went through sort of like a way of doing things, that basically you're screwed and there's no coming back. But nevertheless, I mean, we spent quite a good deal of time sort of like figuring out what the best course of action was. Again, especially on account of the fact that we, you know, basically we get a little bit of everything from like, you know, from architectural plans to that small land, a digital 3D model, and, you know, a piece of paper. How do you reconcile all these like, you know, various things so different from one another, equally sort of like, you know, pointing in the direction of Koza information, right? But once you store all of this, I mean, how do you tag all this up? How do you make sense of say this remarkable variety of things? And I think that's been our conversation for quite a good 10 years. I think that however, sort of like we reached the point that we have an understanding of sort of like what the best practice is. So, would you like to?
yeah, I mean, I think
You're the way behind all this.
well, and the other one is I'm supported by a great team that works on this on the digital aspect of it. So like I think what's nice is I come from a background of classics and librarianship, so I kind of can straddle that line. But there's a lot of people that I'm obviously relying on, right? So like I was not trained in archaeology, so when I'm having questions, I ask Paulson a lot of like, okay, but what's really important about this? Like, can you remind me, like, how important is it to have the soil type in the metadata, or is that something that we can like deal with later? And she'll remind me, like, no, that is like a really important thing that we kind of need to have on the face of it. And then I say, like, okay, cool, thanks, got it. I'm gonna go over to the database team and say, like, yeah, no, we actually do need to have this. And they'll say, okay, I'm gonna go away and like code for 6 hours and then come back and have another thing, and you're gonna tell me whether or not it works. And that's a position that I think I'm lucky enough to be in, that I have, you know, moderate subject knowledge, I can say expertise, moderate subject familiarity enough with the both of these that I can sort of straddle that line. And that's where it gets really important to say, like, I know my limitations in that aspect of like, I can't do this for someone that's working on 3D rigging and 3D animation that would be usable in like motion pictures and film. So I need to find someone who does have that information. But the entire idea of all of that is coming up with an information architecture that can be usable for something as precise as, you know, the paperwork that we need to record for archaeological materials, soil type analysis. Curtis in the chat mentions like geolocations, right? Like that's super important to contextualize the work that's happening. That all needs to exist in a framework that is usable for anthropology, for archaeology, for excavations, and that type of stuff. When you start working with 3D models that have animations built into them so that you can go off and make the next Marvel movie or Disney or Pixar movie or something like that, that's a whole other skill set that I don't, but people do know about, which is why I think like building something that is flexible enough to say like, yeah, we're gonna do interactive, we're gonna do 3D, it works for this, but we also make sure it can be extended and extensible to work in this other area. So yeah, it's that's why it hasn't like, that's why it's not done yet, because it's complicated. But I think that's why it's really interesting that, you know, this is something that we're building for ourselves in a way that kind of makes it work for the type of stuff that we have to do.
And it's applicable to any discipline. I mean, we're talking about archaeology here and fieldwork, but anything that has a materiality can be sort of like treated along the same lines. I mean, all it takes is really show like a sense of sort of like information, materials, and a general like, I don't know, like historical framework as it were, and you have a project that they can follow exactly so like in the same path, or actually ameliorate it, or you know, come up with a better strategy.
Yeah, and I wanted to kick it over to Allison too, because I know she's been doing a lot of work with organizing the COSA excavations Google Drive, and work. I know you are like the primary person for the Airtable, but I know you worked with that, and like credit to the digital COSA Airtable team who are coming up with like their own separate independent database that I've been looking at to say like, oh, cool, I'm gonna take that cell, I'm gonna move here and do all this kind of stuff. So like there's groundwork that's being laid here. But Allison, I don't know if you wanted to like kind of chat a little bit about like the organization that you've been seeing grow since 2013, because I know you were really important in kind of coming up with that.
Yeah, so we originally had just a Google Drive because most of our material was analog. Digital was very basic, just in terms of we type up our trench notebooks at the end of the season, we might scan our, material. And of course that gets really difficult because, you can't, the searchability function for things like that is minimal at best, especially with the variations in handwriting of, these sheets that describe the layers and describe artifacts. And so what we've been doing since 2017-ish is to build, like Matt said, this better Google Drive, a more organized Google Drive that is then pulled into or part of the structure of an Airtable database. And this is something that, we're not entirely married to in terms of it's the only sort of software or program or anything that we would use for a database, but we thought it was nice. I have it up if you want me to show anything on the Airtable at all.
Yeah, just to kind of like point out some of the stuff that kind of like you're recording in the Airtable, and then sort of how that would align with digital. I can find an example of that for later.
All right, let me get this here. Yeah, so can you all see this?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is our Airtable of the main excavations. We do pay money to have this on like a monthly sort of rolling subscription base to have space available for things, because we are pulling in photographs as well. But some of the photographs we also leave on the Google Drive, so we can directly link to say here the Google Drive for these photographs. And I just pulled this up because we are talking about photogrammetry. So these are all the photo models that have been taken since the beginning of the excavation. And so we have links to the Sketchfab models of those that have been generated and uploaded, which aren't every single one, because not every single person has access, or I guess knows how to use the photo model generating software that we use, which is generally just Metashape, the probably basic type of photo model generating software. But we've been adding to this over time as much as possible, incorporating these Sketchfab models, pulling out or saying, this model shows this layer of the trench. It's associated with other layers of the trench. This is a description of the model that we have. These are the photo numbers that we used to build the model. If you want to see those photographs, if you want to go back through each individual photograph that was used, you can just go to the Google Drive and then you just open it up, and we have all the the photographs that were used for that model in this repository here. But it's not just photo models. We also have, what are the trenches that we've excavated over the years? What are the layers? What are the stratigraphic units? All of them, what do we have? Over 1,000 of these records that we have, and they're linked to the sheets that describes them in very basic terms, and in meticulous terms as well. We have special objects that we found, catalog objects that you can sort through and search through by material type. You can really search by anything that you want here. And a lot of these are cross-referenced. And I have to say that while I've been working on this, I'm not the sort of brain behind this. That belongs to Rebecca Frank, who has really been working on this and structuring this Airtable, consulting with everybody, reaching out to everybody, but it's really been her time and labor to make this what it is, as you see it right now. I don't know if there's anything else you want me to talk about on this.
No, I think that's great.
Okay.
Yeah, that Airtable is like amazing to look at. It's just so well organized. It's so like interactive, and I'm hoping that at some point we can like recreate the important parts of the interactivity of sort of linking between sites, between SUs to sort of see the various objects that were found in certain trenches and just sort of have that interactivity, because it's web-based, right? Like that's the beauty of, hyperlinking, is that you can kind of do this sort of nested and sort of linking aspect. So that's one of the things that we're kind of looking to do in a way that doesn't carry a monthly subscription cost, right? So like that's one of the big parts. But yeah, it's every time I look at that, I'm stunned at like how amazing it's been done, like how much work Rebecca and Christina and the entire team have really put in. It's
Outstanding.
Yeah, I don't know if there's. I think you should move on to questions. I think rather than doing something.
We have 2 questions in the chat.
Cool. Okay, let's do it. Okay, so in the chat, Allison, you may have answered one of them.
Yeah, I did. Sorry.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah, that's fine. We were chatting here while you were off in Indiana. Curtis asks, are you taking points at the total station to spatially locate each trench photogrammetry model to make them usable GIS data? And Allison says, yes, with the caveat that we didn't have access to a total station fully throughout the entire season until 2022. So it's been spot checking a handful of things, if I'm correct, previous years, starting last year is when everything was sort of like modeled with geolocations as part of the model. Is that right? Okay. Second question from Curtis, do you have plans to try to geolocate your old models? Those digital elevation models can be very powerful for analysis.
Yes.
Cool.
And sorry, Curtis, for not answering right away. I felt bad after I answered only in the chat for that first question. So yes, I actually just talked to Matt Brennan yesterday, and we're going to start pulling in those models, putting them into ArcGIS. Matt's already built something looking around Bloomington. And so we're going to try to use his methodology that he's been doing here over the course of the year, and then trying to recreate that and pull that in at COSA. He also has experience working at Pompeii, using a portable, sensitive GPS device, and then building a photogrammetry model from which you would take points in the future, as opposed to using a total station at all times, which is a really cool, interesting, innovative way of thinking about taking models and I can't do my words today, taking points in the field. And I only talked to him yesterday about this, so I was going to talk to Andrea about this later, but us maybe doing a sort of experiment using that methodology of taking points using photogrammetry, as opposed to sort of going the more traditional route of, take points, then photo models, incorporate the two. It's a really cool thing. I highly recommend looking at the Pompeii excavation that was done last year for this. They've done really cool stuff. It's run by Allison Emerson out of Tulane. Is that right? She's at Tulane. Yeah. So yes, long answer to a short answer.
Yeah, that's super cool. Yeah. So is the idea that you kind of like take the GIS point of where the camera was when the photo was taken?
Yeah, I believe so. Yeah.
That's super cool. Yeah. We have another question from Andrew Giannotti. What are the impacts on archaeological / heritage ethics with these technologies that you find interesting? I saw the question first, so I'm gonna answer first. I think it's really interesting. So I've been thinking of it in terms of like scanning with like the handheld scanner, scanning and dealing with the questions of like repatriation and sort of like creation of like digital surrogates versus like regular like 3D printed surrogates or sort of like alternates, and how that might affect discussions about repatriation and sort of like access to materials that may have ethical considerations to them, right? So like there's a lot of ethical considerations you can have. The one that immediately jumps to mind, because we're talking about classics, is the sort of Parthenon marbles, right? So there was a big hullabaloo last summer, I believe. There's been the hullabaloo of whether or not those should be returned, right? Base level, that's a ongoing discussion. Not going to bother getting into that because it's way more complicated than we have time for. The thing that was interesting is that there was a director of like a digital, like a cultural heritage digitization group. I think it was like a nonprofit that was doing some 3D scanning or something like that, that requested permission from the British Museum to make high quality scans and was denied. Because they said, no, we don't want to do that. We don't want to give up like our rights to the 3D-ness of these things, which we have. And the guy said, okay, sure, like no problem. I'm gonna route this through my lawyers because I don't think that's like accurate, but like, sure, that's fine, like whatever, we're gonna go through the normal process. And then he walked into the museum and took a bunch of photos with his phone and created a 3D model anyway. And said, you can't stop me, I'm just a regular public patron. I just happen to also be the person who tried to go through the way of doing this like the right way, and you denied it. Who's to say that I can't have done this if I wouldn't have asked in the first place? So like that's now a legal fight too. And whether or not, this all ties back to, and so like I find that really interesting because it's, you know, what museum has the right to tell their patron, no, you can't take photographs of this and then make a 3D model, then 3D print a replica, and then like do with that what you will. Well, the Staatsbibliothek in Berlin back in the early 2000s had a no photography rule for basically the entire piece. And part of that was no flash photography. That's a preservation thing. Sure, okay. But the bust of Nefertiti that they own, that is housed in the Staatsbibliothek. Let me correct myself. The bust of Nefertiti that is housed in the Staatsbibliothek, the Staatsmuseum, sorry. Someone made a scan of that and 3D printed a replica. The museum sued that person saying you don't own the rights to that image. And then Egypt said, hold on, wait a second. You don't either. You don't have any rules to enforce that. And it got embroiled, and I think that case is still going on. So like that's a big thing that I think is kind of going on. And I'm really interested in sort of like where the legal issues of that. So like legal, international, like cultural heritage law as it relates to like 3D scanning and replication and like digital surrogacy. Like does a 3D model on Sketchfab count as a surrogate or copy of the physical object? I don't know, like librarianship has a bunch of ways to talk about that and sort of like the implementation, sort of realization of these types of works. But I just think it's a really interesting question to kind of deal with this and sort of thinking over like ownership and stewardship of the physical objects, the physical sites, and then thinking about what that means for the digital copies as well, and like what that means to kind of like, do I have the rights to make a 3D scan of a thing that is owned by the Italian government while I'm at COSA? Can I do that for academic purposes and for intellectual purposes? Okay. Can I then make a 3D printed replica of it and then sell that? That feels more wrong to me, but like, is there a legal differentiation between that? I don't know. That's interesting.
I think there is one, isn't there? Where you can't sell photographs of things taken, like still photographs taken in a museum in some instances, in some states.
I mean, you're opening a can of worms here. But that being said, for instance, Turkey has produced like a set of very interesting regulations whereby most of the national collections stored at various museums basically are protected by publishing rights. Just like, basically like, think about sort of like, the music industry, how it's wired nowadays with like, the sale of like, publishing rights in millions of dollars. But, basically that is the principle. You want like a replica 3D, you wanted to sort of like produce a 3D replica of like that Nefertiti bust. Say if it were to be accommodated in Turkey, you pay an X amount of money to this company that basically sort of like handles the whole thing. So I think that they're very much at the forefront. They're coming up with like interesting solutions. I mean, this is where basically we're headed, and we'll see sort of like how that lands. With that being said, I'd like to also say just very quickly that this entire sort of like digital component at COSA is absolutely welcomed by the Italian government and not least with the Superintendenza, which is the archaeological authority in Tuscany. It really, if anything, and Andrew's question was right on the mark. I mean, I think that if anything, sort of like this flurry of activities really heightens our conversation with the local authorities. They're happy to see what we do. We're at this very time, Matt, you're selling yourself short, and you and Allison are producing a great video with all these various facets of our research. We combine and collate it, and we're going to give this video to the COSA Museum, this very tiny museum at the site that it uses some help. It uses like a little bit of like lifting and. In other words, I think if anything, there are like only benefits. And so like the more, especially the more that you are inclined to share sort of your outcomes, I mean, it really aids the conversation because of course, conversation with authorities at times can be complicated. But this is a new way to sort of like, foster a higher sense of sort of like cooperation.
Yeah, I think that's based on the good relationship you have with the Superintendenza in the first place, right? So like this is something that they see as beneficial because there has been a good relationship, because there has been respect paid to the site. I think that helps, obviously. But yeah, I think Superintendenza is seeing that this is beneficial for outreach components. And as Allison kind of mentioned, like the outreach opportunities, the educational opportunities that a lot of this 3D technology has afforded, I think kind of helps sharing and sort of disseminating of this in ways that are beneficial. Are there any questions from the room?
This is very practical.
Go ahead,
Yeah, you use Sketchfab for the photogrammetry. What was the cost?
There's a free option. So there's a handful of options you can do. It's a freemium model, right? So I think Allison, you paid for the pro.
I got doctored or grandfathered in when they switched over to EDU to pro or something. I forget. I don't pay anything.
Really? Okay. Basically, I have the completely free version, and my limit is that I'm allowed 10 model uploads per month if I don't want them to be downloadable. So if I make them downloadable, I have a limit. So like for these, for like the COSA models, it's like, I mean, I'm producing them with the blessing of the folks here that they're Creative Commons licensed, so they're reusable and shareable, and therefore I'm leaving them open to download, and therefore I have unlimited uploads. The limitations are for storage space more so, so like each model can only be so large. And I don't know if that's the case for you, Allison.
Yeah, I can't remember. I don't know.
It hasn't really run into a problem. It's not been.
Is it stored on Sketchfab or is it stored here at FSU?
right now Sketchfab, but we're looking to switch over to digital here locally.
And does the user need specific software? Am I gonna look at it in my browser? I guess.
Yeah, so that's what the thing that we were trying to build
Mhm.
with the digital 3D object viewer would mean that no one has to have any specialist software downloaded. You can just interact with it in the browser, like you could on Sketchfab or any of these other web-based browser viewer tools. What we can do right now is we can upload a 3D model. You would have to download yourself and use it in your own personal software. But we figured that that wasn't a good answer to like a good usability question. So that was sort of like, you know, experts are going to be able to do that, sure, but then no one else. So we wanted to have the viewer be as low barrier of entry as possible, and that's why we're trying to develop that one particularly. Same thing that like a web-based PDF viewer, like video player, audio player, is kind of built in already to digital. We wanted to do the same thing, but with 3D.
And it's great with inscriptions.
Yeah, I don't know if I showed a lamp, but I do have several inscriptions.
Yeah, we have a bunch, yeah.
Any other questions? Getting close to time, but do still have time. Yeah.
When you're talking about accessibility, how important is it for you to put out materials that are free for people? Because if you're using digital, are only people affiliated with FSU able to view objects?
Yeah, digital is completely open. Well, okay. There is an ability for digital to place an embargo on something, and that's usually for like dissertations. So like if you finish your dissertation, you place an embargo on it so that you can publish your first book within a year, 3 years or something like that, and then it's open. But for these, they would be all open because there's not sort of any like restriction. But if it goes into digital, it has to be accessible. At least the metadata has to be accessible so that you would know that it's there. I know Stuart could probably correct me if I'm wrong because he works with digital a lot, but yeah, so it's basically like if it goes into digital, you wouldn't load it into digital without the view for it being publicly accessible. There are certain things that you need to have like certain access like certain access privileges. So there are certain things that we have that we can't make available unless you're on campus, which again, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be affiliated with the university, but like it kind of does, right? Like there is a way that the public can get access on campus, but if you're from like Seattle, Washington, and you want to get access, it's unlikely that you would come here specifically for that, but there are reasons that you
I was wondering if this individual objects like this, where they have some sort of depth, I was wondering if you all incorporated any of the RTI technology to get more different views, different angles, highlights of certain objects, or was it strictly the 3D content of scanners that go with you?
This, y'all have done some RTI in the past, right? Early on.
We tried some, yes, but you know, not to. It was just more like some few attempts, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so the ones that I've done starting like a couple of years ago have been exclusively 3D scan, not RTI. But I know there have been some RTIs. Allison, did you do any RTI?
I'm trying to think back. I was thinking about it, but I don't think we actually implemented it.
You didn't Matt do some.
Matt did something, but I can't remember what it was.
I think
we've been trying a lot of things.
Yeah, I think mainly because the viewers were sort of more proprietary than they were. It's like a file type, so like, as you know.
Those you have to download like the software to run it, and
Mhm.
why it's a bit kind of, yeah,
Right.
a bit more clunky, but you do have a lot more options to view these things that can give you
Yeah.
more spectral imaging type of things where you can't really get just straight on photo whether or not it's 3D, but it's also a lot more work to set them up. I was just curious if you all did that.
Yeah, one of the things I've been interested in working on, and I haven't had a chance to work on it with this, but there are some really good examples of this. Some folks have been so what we see here is sort of like the live render if it were replicated. So like this is what the marble looks like. But there are some folks that are replacing the textures with not just the marble. And so like this happens when a lot of like sensor data for like engineering a lot. And so like you have this, but then you also have like the heat map of like where parts are hot versus for like an engine or something like that. And you'd also have like X-ray, and you could also have like other things that you could add as a texture that may not be like visible light spectrum. And so I think that might be something where you could potentially do like raking light texture number 1, where you sort of like you do the scan, but the light source is only coming from one severe direction. You might have something like that, but I've not played with it yet.
Understood.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So like this is like the actual model as it's generated with no textural information. So like the scanner is getting a lot of like the bumps and cut marks and a lot of stuff. The reason this scanner, I forgot to mention that this scanner was only capable, we were only able to get this through a collaborative grant that we received from, I was written into a grant that Andrea and Tom Lever from Anthropology got with the express intentions of like trying to work on stuff that had really, really fine detail. You know, Allison was working on not Potter's marks, maker's marks of tile, right? Yeah. So like it was stuff that we needed to be able to see like the indentations of like thumbprints and like sort of scribbles with reed in ceramic. And so like there are some things like again, like, this is a inscriptions like this big. So like all of the features are pretty large, but there are some other ones that are a little bit there's a oh, it's not in here, but there's a bone pin that has a like worked bone that you can see like cut marks on, which is really cool. It's like it highlights certain aspects of it more without the texture on it, and you can see it better with just the 3D like sensed data rather than the actual photogrammetry data, which is pretty cool. But I don't have that example in this collection. We only had a couple minutes left. Thank you all for coming on Zoom and in person. There is a recording of this, so if you want to share with anybody, we'll make those available sort of at the end of this the series. Our next one will be on April 4th in Strozier, over in the instruction classroom, also on Zoom. So thank you all very much for coming. Thank you. If you haven't signed in. Thank you, Allison. Really good to see you guys. Thank you.